From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value, but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week when we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narratives about men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you in part by Let's Get Real, where forensic accountant Tiffany Couch uses her financial skills to shine the light on the real issues we all face every day. If you'd like to make decisions based on fact rather than on cultural pressure, go to letsgetreallife.com, a place where you can find tools to improve your communication skills and increase your connection to humanity. That's letsgetreallife.com. Today on the show, we're going to talk about how to raise countercultural kids. But first, two quick announcements. If you have not become a Patreon supporter, now is the time to do so. As always, there are 4 very economical levels, and those who sign up now at the $20 level receive a signed copy of the Alpha Female's Guide to Men and Marriage. This offer lasts through the end of the year and then goes away. So act now if this is something that interests you. Second, I'm now also offering 15% off 2 of my coaching packages. The premarital or newly married option, which highlights the 4 main potential stressors of every marriage and how to resolve those now so they don't become a problem later. And my new life coaching for college women option, in which I help young women map out a life that actually works and that offers the best chance at true happiness. The coupon code for each of these packages, again, that's the premarital option and the life coaching for college women option, is capital XMAS for Christmas. I hope we knew what that was. XMAS. This offer also continues through the end of the year. Just go to SuzanneVenker.com/coaching and you will find those options at the bottom. And now on with the show. Okay, guys. So now that my husband and I are almost empty nesters, which I absolutely cannot believe, I was thinking back on all the ways that we raised our kids differently from, I guess, the norm, right? Or whatever the modern way of parenting is. Not to say that we are complete opposite of that, but definitely opposite enough to where it was sort of obvious, at least to my kids, our kids. I feel like every step of the way, we took some sort of heat for parenting differently than the way other people did, beginning with our babies' sleep schedules. I remember that, to my staying home with them, which wasn't, it wasn't unpopular entirely, but it was certainly not the norm, to the shows we'd let them watch, to talking about money and sex and the differences between boys and girls. I can't believe that I have to say that this is countercultural, but unfortunately that's what it's come to. And there, there was never any other way for us to parent except the way that he and I believed strongly was the right way to do it. And we are not easily influenced by whatever is going on in the culture. So it's a requirement for sure, if you're going to do this, that you are able to withstand, looks or comments. That's one thing. That you can live differently than the people around you. That's another thing. And because we're both very strong about living true to ourselves and what we want, and we're not really, concerned with what other people think, it wasn't as difficult for us as it might be for someone else. But at the end of the day, we are living in very different times, as everyone listening to this program knows. That's why you're here. And if you don't have some sort of structure in place and hopefully guidance to parent differently or do anything differently than the norm, than the culture tells you, it's very, very difficult. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It's not, it's human nature to want to go along with what people are doing. You don't want to stand out from the crowd. But unfortunately, I personally believe, while I would have done this in any era, desperate times call for desperate measures. And at this point, I just feel like there's just no way to succeed at parenting if you don't do it opposite than the way the culture is doing it today. That's where we are. So I'm going to go through the different ways that I could think of in which he and I were sort of doing things opposite of the way what you probably, if I don't know, it depends on what stage you're in. I don't know if you've already raised kids, if you're listening to this, if you're just about to, if you're in the middle of it, hopefully this will help, but you will undoubtedly recognize how these, how the style was different from the norm. Okay. So if you guys have followed this podcast pretty faithfully, and even if you haven't, you can go back and look at previous episodes and look for the ones. There's 2 of them I've done with a psychoanalyst named Erica Komisar. And I love Erica Komisar. It's not a secret. She is so unusual because she is willing to talk about the significance of the early years in parenting from birth to age 3 or 4, and why being there in those years, especially for mothers, and how that differs from fathers, is so critical. And she does it in a way that is very, I don't know, what's the word, palatable. It's just, she's completely different from me. I'm much more polemic, I guess. And she's just laying out the facts, and she has a very soft, kind way of doing it. And that's her style, and it works. So I'm very impressed with her. I respect her a great deal. So go back and see if you can find those. I'm not sure exactly what the titles are. One has to do with mother's absence from the home, and the other has to do with emotionally unavailable mothers. I think those are the 2 titles if you're scrolling through. Okay, so I'm bringing her up because those early years, one of the things that women have heard, women and men have heard, Americans, people have heard for the past 20, 30 years is this bogus idea of quality time. The idea is supposed to be that you can be apart from your babies and toddlers, because we're really talking, it's important all the way up. I'm going to focus on just the early years for a moment for a specific reason, but it actually applies to birth to 18. But the idea of quality time, a completely bogus term, is the idea that if you are gone, 40, 50, 60 hours a week for your job, that you can make up the hours that you were not with your children if you make that 1 or 2 hours really, really count. And the very first book that I ever wrote, which today is called The 2-Income Trap, it actually was re-released recently under a different title. Let's see, The 2-Income Trap. In that book, I talk about how, why that term is so bogus. And at the time that I was writing it, this was 20 years ago when I first wrote it, it was all the rage. The amount of research I did for that book is just off the charts. I read every single thing I could get my hands on about motherhood and the early years. And at the time there was this, they called it the mommy wars. And it was between, supposedly between stay-at-home moms and working moms, although I think that so much of that was media driven, just to conjure a fight, in order to have something to talk about on media and get people riled up. But at any rate, so there was no shortage whatsoever of articles and books to read that honestly mostly were written by working mothers, hardcore working mothers, because obviously stay-at-home moms don't typically get on their soapbox, present company excluded. And so they're not writing books, right? They're doing the work, as was I, but I would use those moments when my first child, well, actually I only wrote that book when I had one child, and then I disappeared for about 5 years and just blogged a little bit when I had my second, because there's no way to get anything done when you have 2. But I would use every moment that my baby was sleeping to be on my soapbox. Just because that's who I am. But at any rate, most people don't do that. So the majority of the material that I was reading were from these working mothers who were literally exactly like I just described. They were gone 40, 50, 60 hours from their children, their babies. They had nannies, they were in daycare, and they spent the time justifying or explaining why quality time is a thing, right? That they could come home. And I remember actual statements from women or mothers who would talk about how that 1 hour, making that 1 hour before the child goes to bed really, really count. And I was just in awe of the whole thing. So, at any rate, I don't think we hear so much about that whole quality time anymore, but we certainly did for a long, long time. And it stuck. It really stuck. I think people think that it's no longer even questioned whether or not a mother needs to be there in the early years, which was why Erica Komisar's book Being There that came out a few years ago, I was so excited to read that. I know that was out there because nobody discusses it anymore. I think back when I wrote that book 20 years ago, it was very much in the media. Like I said, it was a discussion. It was a debate all the time. And now it's just inculcated in the culture where you just don't even discuss it. So that if someone says they just had a baby and they put the baby in daycare, 8-10 hours a day all week, no one even bats an eyelash. But back then people were still batting eyelashes, hence the debates. But today people say it like they say they're getting divorced. Divorce and daycare used to be something that required a response and attention and analysis, but it no longer does. It's just a thing. It's just a thing that's done. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because so much of raising countercultural kids or raising kids at all, quite honestly, begins in those early years with building a bond. And the bond is not something that can happen in an hour a day. It's something that happens as a result of putting in the time, the quantity. It's the complete opposite of quality. Putting in the time, the hours that are needed to establish that bond in the early years. There's just so much that goes on in the first 3 years that is intangible and very hard to put on paper, which is why it gets overlooked, why it's very easy to overlook it. People want to talk, often when you read about this stuff, they want to talk about it with respect to what the outcomes are, how well my child does in school, whether or not she gets a job later in life. And these things are supposed to sort of prove whether or not your home matters in those early years. But in fact, it doesn't at all, because what matters in those early years is the emotional development. And that's much harder to quantify. You can't say getting a degree or a job has anything to do with your emotional makeup. So that's why I think this topic was always so difficult to debate in the media, for sure, because you don't have enough time. You only get these 3-minute, segments when you have to give a soundbite or two, which is not enough to discuss what goes on in those early years. So building that bond. And even if you miss the first year, there's always options later to cut back or stop working to give children the time that they need so that you can establish that bond with them. And the reason why this is so important is because as you go along in the subsequent 18 years, you want to be able to draw upon that early bond. If you want to be heard, if you want to be respected, if you want to have your children absorb your guidance or even discipline. We're going to talk about that too. So that's sort of step one. That's the first thing I thought of, was just being there in those early years establishes the foundation for later discipline and later connection and growth with your children. And so that alone right there was the first countercultural thing I could think of that we did. Certainly we were not alone. In fact, this one isn't as counterculture as some of the things I'm going to talk about, because the truth is there are more people who do that than not. And I think that's really important to understand, because the message you get from the media is that pretty much there's no such thing as staying home anymore. And that's true in the technical sense. There's only about 25% of married mothers. Now we're talking about married mothers now, not single mothers. That's a different conversation. But for married mothers, only about 1/4 are not employed throughout the duration of those years at home, sort of like it was for our mothers and grandmothers. And then another 1/4, little more than 1/4 actually, are what you'd call full-time working mothers, where their kids are with a nanny or in daycare. But the vast majority in the middle are part-timers who move in and out of the workforce as the needs of their children change. That would be me, for example. schedule. So maybe they're home for X amount of years and then they're not. Maybe they work part-time one year and then not at all another year. I've only begun myself working really full-time the last 2 years, and I'm almost an empty nester. So there's a lot. That's a huge group that gets absolutely no acknowledgement in the media. All of which is to say, it's not quite as countercultural to be home in the early years as you might think. Okay, that was the first one. I also was thinking back about those years, and what came to mind is how our kids were on a very strict sleep schedule. And so my husband and I, our lives were, for those years, I want to say the first 4 years, because that's really, children are napping. And of course, it depends on how many you have. We have 2. For the first 4 years of our parenting life, maybe 5, because we had 2, so 5 or 6 years, I guess. Our lives were our adult lives were orchestrated around the children's sleep schedules. And so we would be out, let's say we wanted to go to an event of some sort and it involved the children. We would bring them for X amount of time and then leave in order to stay on that schedule. And we would get a lot of flack for that. And the reason why we did that is not because we didn't want to stay and continue having fun. Obviously we did, but we sacrificed it so that the kids got the sleep that they needed, actually for selfish reasons. I mean, definitely because I'm a big health nut and I believe hugely in sleep and good food and all of that for our health, but physical and mental health, but also because keeping them on a schedule was much, much easier for us as parents to be able to parent. Because if they get the sleep they need, and every parent knows, I don't mean we did this perfectly across the board. Every parent knows that when a child that age is not sleeping, it is absolute mayhem. I mean, it's chaos. They are out of control of themselves. You can't discipline them when they're tired, for example, because they're not in control of their bodies. Their bodies are not going to react to your discipline. I remember seeing this a lot with, other friends or contemporaries who weren't so consistent or weren't at all consistent with the sleep schedules, and they were unable to discipline. And I'd watch it and I'd want to scream, he just needs to go to sleep. And then you can discipline him properly. He'll respond. But you cannot expect him to listen and respond if he's sleep deprived. It just doesn't work. So a lot of that sleep, I called myself sort of a sleep Nazi, and I took a lot of flack for it, but it worked. I'm here to tell you it worked. So that's an example of something where, you're going to take a lot of shit from people for doing it that way, and you're not going to have as much fun because you're going to cut out of a party early, but it's absolutely worth it. Because it has a domino effect when you later go to, as I say, attempt to discipline, which is an integral part of parenting and has to be done. Okay, and then speaking of discipline, I would say another way that we were very countercultural is that we never thought of our children, still don't, but it's sort of changing now because they're becoming adults, so eventually it does change. We never thought of them as our friend. We never were concerned with whether or not they liked us per se. It was what they needed. And that is also very countercultural today because I'm sure, again, people listening know that over the last 20 years, that has been a huge theme in parenting is that parents just don't want to discipline their kids because they want them to like them or they want to be their friend. And you see that message in the media constantly. And so the idea of old school discipline is definitely out and being your kid's friend is in. And I'm here to tell you that depending on what type of old school discipline you're talking about, it neither one actually works. If you're talking about old school, really old school, like in my parents' day, where it was sort of children are meant to be seen but not heard kind of thing, definitely not that kind of old school discipline. But there is a huge middle ground between that and today's permissiveness and being your kid's friend, which is just an utter disaster for everybody. And that middle ground has to do with being authoritative, right? Rather than aggressive and domineering, but just letting your children know that they are safe because they're with parents who are in control of them and their surroundings. Now, this is when they're younger. This changes, of course, when they become teenagers. But when they're younger, a lot of parents don't realize that what kids actually crave is to be safe. And they want those boundaries, and they want the discipline, and they want the rules. And that's what has not gotten across to a lot of parents in the last 20 or 30 years, because the idea was that, parents were too strict in the past and that didn't work. So we're going to go extreme in the other direction and just sort of be their friends and let them, have all this latitude. And it just doesn't work. Kids are not meant to have latitude when they're young. They crave you they love it when you say no. They know that they are safe, that they don't want to make decisions. They're too young to make them, right? And that comes later. It's a gradual thing that over time, there's different stages of development for children, and you have to recognize which stage requires which kind of parenting. So that's another thing that I thought of, is just that the idea of being your kid's friend was not something we entertained at all. Okay, now I'm laughing a little bit because I'm looking at this next one. I'm imagining my kids listening to me now. Another thing we did that I still do get flack today, even from my kids. But that's because now that they look back, they're kind of at the stage where they think it's funny, but I don't care what they say. They actually loved it back then, is that we raised them with very old school TV. So Little House on the Prairie, the Waltons, classic films, material of substance. And there just there's so little to nothing of substance today in the media that you have to dig back to get it. That was my theory then. It's actually worse today than it was when they were younger, but those shows are timeless. They tell stories and they impart values that literally do not ever change. That's why first of all, I like watching them. So I wasn't suffering sitting there. In fact, I still watch the Waltons today, especially today, now that things have gone off the rails in our country. I'm like, just take me back to a place where people, were normal and had common sense and all of that. So yeah, they were raised on these shows that their friends didn't know what that was. They'd come in, if it was accidentally on, their friends would come in, and they'd say, what is that? And actually there was a time where the kids were really proud of it and they didn't know any different. They thought everybody watched that. And it wasn't until they really became teenagers that they realized, no, their friends had no idea what that stuff was. And I think at that point they became a little embarrassed about it, which I don't care. It's totally normal for them to be embarrassed when they're teenagers, right? That's just normal. So now they're kind of over it and they're not interested in the older stuff anymore because of their ages. But for many, many years, that's what they were raised on. And it was extremely helpful because essentially what they were watching when they were exposed to media was support for the way we were doing things. So even though our lives are modernized, and even though we may have more money, let's say, than you see on Little House on the Prairie or even the Waltons, none of that really mattered because the values that we were imparting as parents were very, very similar to what they were seeing on TV. That's hugely helpful because so many kids, as you know, are raised on this trash that they're seeing that's complete opposite of probably the way their parents do things. And it's very, influential. It's very influential. Media is so impactful. It's so powerful. And you have to watch what they take in and monitor that, which I did. Most of it fell to me because we had a traditional household. My husband was, working Monday through Friday. I was home. And to the extent that I worked, it was, I was still the main person at home always through the week. So I was kind of in charge of that. And the reality is, it was really, that went on for years. Now, keep in mind, this was pre-phone era and pre-social media. For the first, I want to say 12 years of both of our kids' life, phones and social media were a non-issue. And I thank God that was the case now that I see what I see. I think that's probably a whole nother show with maybe a guest, because that's Yeah, that's a big topic. So just keep in mind, I didn't have to fight against that for the first, 12 years of their lives. So that's a big deal. But I definitely still had to monitor it because you still had junk on TV and you still had, I don't, it all kind of runs together now. I can't remember. There were video games, just all of it has to be monitored. And if you're not physically there, you're not going to be able to monitor it. Which is not to say if you are there, that all parents who are physically there do monitor it. It's just to say that if you're not there at all, you definitely can't monitor it. And then if you are there, it's so easy to use all of that as a babysitter. And you have to be able to regulate that and attempt to live at least somewhat as though that wasn't the case, as though the media in this form that we have today isn't there. And that's extremely difficult, especially for parents of younger children now. And I do feel for them. And like I said, that's a whole nother conversation that I'm not going to get into now. But anyway, so media and how to combat that. That's another countercultural way of raising your kids, is just simply less media. It's never going to be no media because we're so far into it. There's no, in my opinion, way to have no media, and plus I'm not an extreme person at all. I'm big on moderation and learning how to live within reason with what we've got going on today. So that's a huge countercultural parenting issue is media. Another one is using every opportunity that you have and that you see to counteract social messaging. So this could be watching TV together, or when they're watching and you're walking through and you see something said on TV that you're like, what? And don't just walk out of the room and just let that go on day in and day out. Stop, pause the TV, have a conversation about it. Now, once again, if I heard my daughter if my daughter were listening to this right now, she'd be like, okay, but don't do it the way my mom did it because it was constant. And that's true. But keep in mind what I do work-wise. Like, this is what I do, so much of what I do. So I am definitely over the top on that. So I'm not suggesting that anybody needs to do that at all. I'm simply suggesting to not be the opposite of that, where you just sort of walk through and don't address it at all. You can have some sort of happy medium between my being so attentive to that and then not being attentive at all. So when you see or you read something that they are being exposed to, and this is especially true not just with TV and media, but in their schools. In their schools. In fact, maybe that's even bigger than media. I don't know. It's a toss-up. But either which way, you've got to stop and counteract that messaging, because you can almost guarantee that where we are today is so bad on this front, because it's all progressive, left-leaning crap, that you cannot afford to not counteract it daily. Weekly for sure. That's how much they're getting all the time. And again, start young. That's why I opened this conversation by talking about the early years. The more you've established that bond, and I don't even just mean from birth to age 3, but even in the earlier years, from 4 to 10, the more you've established a bond where they trust you and respect you and love. Well, of course they love you no matter what, but trust and respect you. The more chance that they will listen to you when you do counteract those social messages. Now, that's not to say that they're not going to go through a rebellious period. They will, but you've got to get it in their heads first, so they know and have had exposure to the other side of the equation, and then they'll figure it all out down the road. You just don't want to go through the whole parenting experience never having done that, because then even if they go whatever direction they're going to go, that at least you did all you could. Let's put it that way. So all of which is to say, just don't be silent and so into your own life that you're not paying attention to all of this. That's all I'm saying. And that includes news stories, by the way, the movies you see together. There's a lot of movies. Don't think that just because it's Disney, it's harmless. There's a lot of movies you can watch that send very specific messages to your kids. And you got to pay attention to what those messages are, especially even if they're subliminal. because again, you only have them for so long. And so you want to take that opportunity to tell them the truth if what they're being fed is not true. When you got married, things were perfect. You were both in love and life was good. Then somewhere along the line, everything changed. She changed, or maybe he did. Either which way, now your relationship feels, well, hard. I coach husbands and wives who feel lonely, disrespected, or misunderstood in their relationship. So many women today are desperate for their husbands to step up to the plate, to make a decision and to stick to it, to lead rather than to follow. Ladies, you have the power to make it happen. Men respond best to women who are grounded in their feminine core. As for husbands, so many of them want their wives to stop nagging and to just trust them, to smile more and to complain less, to look at them the way they did when they were first dating. Men, you have the power to make it happen. Women respond best to men who are grounded in their masculine core. The secret to lasting love rests in the masculine-feminine dance. Once you master it, your relationship will no longer be difficult. You'll be moving with the biological tide rather than against it, and that makes marriage smooth sailing. If you're struggling in your relationship, if you feel frustrated or alone, I can help. Just go to SuzanneVenker.com, that's SuzanneVenker.com, and click on the coaching button at the top. Don't wait another minute to acquire the mindset you need to find love and to sustain it. It's so much easier than you think. That's SuzanneVenker.com. Okay, 3 more. We did not jump on the let's travel all over the country to play sports idea, which has been going on for at least 10 years. And of course, that's a complicated issue. Again, maybe needing its own segment, but our son played hockey for quite some time until he was injured, and then that was the end of that. But there were a number of years there, and my husband, by the way, is obsessed with hockey, loves hockey. It was a bonding thing for him and our son, and it was great. But we made a decision together that we were never going to go to that top tier where you literally travel all over the place and spend all your money doing it, which we just thought was absolute insanity. And so I guess in retrospect, it was kind of good that our son was injured because it kind of sent him in a different direction, which I'm not going to get into now, but a very positive direction too. So it's all good. But my point is just that back when we were dealing with that, that was really difficult because everybody around us was doing the traveling. And so to not do it is to stand out, and standing out, again, it's not fun. It's hard. It's hard. I mean, it's hard. But so glad we did. Okay. And then, this one's big. Money and sex. Let's see. I would say to some degree, to a large degree, every era of parents, I believe, every generation of parents has had difficulty teaching their kids about money and sex. I mean, it's just, there's such big subjects and very difficult for parents to deal with. I know that. And that's not generational. What is generational, with specific to sex now, we'll come back to money, is that it used to be very common up until recently to teach your children either overtly or even more subtly that there's a difference between male and female, that there's boys and there's girls. And here's what that means today, and here's what that will mean for your life down the road. And I would say of all the countercultural parenting that we did, this was probably the biggest. We are not afraid to talk to our children about the fact that their lives are going to look very different because one is boy and one is male and one is female. One is going to be a man and going to be a woman, on their way now to that. They're a young man and a young woman. And that will require different life plans, depending, of course, on what you want. So this is a really big deal. This is probably the biggest of everything I'm talking about right now, because it's so topical, and we're getting deeper and deeper into this idea that there's no differences between men and women. So we're supposed to teach our children that they're basically going to have the same lives because that's how we prove our equality or whatever. I'll give you an example of a client I have right now, a coaching client, and there's nothing unusual about her. She's the norm from what I can tell. They're all millennials that I work with. No one talked to the daughters about how their lives would look different, presumably from the man they would marry. So, for example, first of all, marriage was not considered. And I'm generalizing here. Obviously, there are parents who don't do it this way, but the trend, let's call it that. The trend, the norm is to raise boys and girls as though they are the same. That means that there is no recognition for the fact that girls will eventually be the one that have babies, but boys will not. And that means that your life's trajectory is going to look very different from a man's. No one tells them that. They also don't talk about, and there's different ways to account for that. There's the biological clock. In other words, that a boy can postpone marriage longer than a girl if he wants, much more easily. 2, that as a woman, you are going to want the chances of your wanting to be out of the workforce at some point of time to take care of your baby is huge. Huge. How do you plan in advance for that? How do you plan a life for that? What kind of decisions can you make prior to that day coming that will allow you to do that? Instead, there is just a moratorium on the subject. It's just silence. People are afraid. The culture has caused parents to be afraid of saying to a daughter, look, what do you want, right? What do you want your life to look like? If you happen to have a daughter who says, not when she's 16, because chances of you changing your mind are pretty great. But let's say she's 20 or she's 21, 22. I want to be a trial lawyer. I want to be a brain surgeon. If she says anything that's of a really big nature where she's choosing a career path that is literally all consuming, and she does not want children, not much to say there. Fine, great, go for it. The vast majority of daughters are not going to say that. They're probably going to say something along the lines of, I really want to have a good marriage and I want a good family and I want to have X amount of children, 2.5, 3, 4, whatever. And I'd also like to have some form of professional life at some point. Now, that's looking at their life on the whole, right? From 20 to 80, let's say, instead of just 20 to 30. Because too many daughters right now are taught to just think in terms of the here and the now, as though this desire or interest for this big life and this career is going to consume your entire life. There's no discussion of the long term. So that's why they end up getting themselves into a pickle down the road. So going back to this coaching client I was explaining, no one said to her, who, by the way, this particular client was raised in a, what she calls a fancy family. So a wealthy family. And she became used to a very certain standard of living because her parents essentially gave her everything, gave her the best of everything. And that's just how they chose to do it. And what they didn't do is twofold. Number one, they never said anything about money and taught her about money. So that really set her back. That's one thing. But also they never said to her, hey, look, at some point you're going to want to have children. Oh, well, she did want to have children, by the way. She has 3 children. At some point you're going to have children and your priorities are going to change. So let's figure out a path that works with that reality rather than this singular path that's going to get you, on a road that down the road you're going to be stuck, which is somewhat of what happened. Because of that lack of parental guidance, the decisions that young people make ultimately end up not serving them well down the road. Why? Because parents were not going to raise their children in a countercultural fashion. In fact, it's the parents who do raise their children in countercultural fashion who end up, in my opinion, winning in the end. Because they got the information that they needed, that the culture and the media wasn't going to tell them, in order to map out lives that work. And this is true with sex, with money, with marriage. everything outside of just the conversation about education and career. So much about all you ever hear is education, and career. But you've got to fit in these other conversations around that if you want to map out a life that works. So I don't know if I brought this, so I'm just going to move over to the money conversation real quick. I've been following Dave Ramsey for this entire year, and he has a podcast. Well, it's a radio show, but it's also a podcast that's several hours a day, and there's tons of call-ins all the time. That's why I like it. It's just a call-in show, and it's very fascinating. And his whole shtick, if you will, is to teach people how not to be in debt and how to live with debt and how to organize and budget their money. And everything he says is commonsensical from way back when. It's completely countercultural for today because his main message is that debt sucks, that debt's bad. But debt is, quote unquote, normal. He uses the word normal all the time because that's what people do. They go into debt for everything, to buy a car, to go to school. He does understand you have to have a mortgage when you buy a home, which is good. But everything outside of that, borrowing and being in debt, whether it's credit cards or school or cars or whatever, or consumer debt in general, is considered normal, when in fact it actually keeps you from moving ahead financially and becoming wealthy. So that's his message. What made me think of that? Oh, so many of the call-ins that he gets are people who are living their lives specifically opposite of that and coming out ahead on the other side. So that's an example of how countercultural thinking is actually win-win. He ends up getting into a lot of marital and relationship problems because, as you know, that's very much connected with money and marriage. And so he gets a lot of couples, for example, who call in and they marry. I noticed a common theme. They marry younger rather than later, and they're on track financially as opposed to being in debt up to their eyeballs, or they are in debt up to their eyeballs and they're slowly working their way out, but they're working as a team with their spouse. All of which is to say, these people who are calling in there are living very differently from your typical millennial who takes on all this debt and gets married later in life and ends up in this bad place. And these other people, because they are doing it so counterculturally, don't end up in that same place. That's why I'm mentioning it. So it's so similar to my message. His is really about money. Mine's about marriage and relationships, but they go together. And that if you live opposite of the way most people around you do, you're gonna win in the end. And that's basically the message of this podcast. And the last thing I wanted to mention was college. Going back to what I was just saying about Dave Ramsey, one of the things that they talk about is helping people go through college debt-free or relatively debt-free. And that's another example of something that we've done in that, there are basically two ways to go through college relatively debt-free. That is, if your parents are able to pay for it, which is great. Or if not, if you're in the category that your parents can't cover it or can't cover half of it or some of it or whatever, that you choose a college that you can afford, right? But that's not encouraged or talked about. You're supposed to go to the biggest, the best college you can find, regardless of what it costs, as though getting a degree from that particular university is of extreme value to the family and that it's going to make your life, right? I don't subscribe to that. And so the idea that you have to go to a specific college to get your degree and pay out the wazoo for it and go into debt for it, I would never do if we were in that boat. If we had kids who literally had no way if we had absolutely nothing to offer them on the college front, we would steer them toward a local college, or not a local, but a state school. And then you would teach them early on about scholarships and encourage good grades or what, there are things you would do in advance knowing that coming up that could help offset that, as opposed to just, just take on as much debt as you need. You'll pay it off. You'll get a good job or whatever. And this is especially a problem when you're teaching your daughters this message, because here's another talk about countercultural. This is a really taboo, controversial thing to say, but I don't care. It's true. And that is that the vast majority of women, the vast majority who start out on a track as though they're like men, where the sky's the limit and they're going to take on all this debt and they're going to have these big jobs and they're going to make all this money, the vast majority of them hit a point in their life where they no longer want that. This isn't just my experience in working with them. The data shows this. They hit a point. And by the way, this is the real reason why that gender gap exists. And you'll never hear about this in the media. Because women and men are different. You're going to come, the chances of your getting to a point in your life where living that linear existence of just producing and breadwinning is going to sort of run its course, and you're going to want something different, is so astronomically high that it makes no sense to raise your daughters to assume that's not going to be the case. If it ends up being the case, which is a minority, okay, but why plan for it? Plan for what you know will likely happen. So part of that is choosing a college that you can afford so that you don't end up in debt up to your eyeballs and then having to stay employed 24/7, 365 days a year in order to pay that off when you really don't even want to be working that much. Maybe you don't want to work at all for an X amount of time, or maybe you want to work part-time, but you want a life that actually doesn't cause you to have to just chase after the dollars so you can pay off something that you shouldn't have done to begin with. So that's another big one, is this idea of debt. College debt is a huge countercultural message. And I know, even though that's not a big aspect of the way my husband and I mean, it's one thing, but it's not a huge thing. I would say probably what's bigger for us on the countercultural front when it comes to money is that we talk to our kids about money and tell them they know everything. You know, they hear us talking about it. We have budget meetings. They're required to get jobs. They both have been working since they were 16. Just, you know, instead of just walking through and not teaching them about it, we did. And we were comfortable with that. So that's probably more the way we taught counterculture than the college per se. But at any rate, I thought of that just with respect to the Dave Ramsey thing, because so much of what he's teaching is totally countercultural and it is working. And that's very similar to my message. So all of which is to say, the more you raise your children in a countercultural fashion, the more successful they will be. It doesn't mean it isn't that it's 100% foolproof so much as you've done your job. You've counteracted all that junk that's coming at them, and the rest is up to them, right? The rest is up to them. But I truly believe that parental influence is much bigger than people realize. It's true that the culture is hugely influential, and it can actually undermine parenting. I do believe that. And it does for X amount of years when they're young. When they're like teenagers and in college. But eventually, if you're modeling something different and you've taught them differently all along, it will come back. It will be incorporated into their thinking, even if they temporarily check out. So that's the message of today's podcast. Raise countercultural kids. And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to tune in next week when I will be back again with a new subject that I am not going to tell you about. You just have to come back and see. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week.